When we think of medieval dining, vivid images of grand feasts often come to mind: torchlit castle halls, roasted meats, exotic spices, and wine-filled goblets. Popular films and shows have cemented this romantic vision. Yet, these scenes represent rare occasions enjoyed by the nobility, not the everyday meals of the vast majority who worked the land. Medieval peasants, who made up about 90% of Europe's population, lived in constant tension with hunger. Their diets were shaped by necessity, seasonal cycles, and the demands of the feudal system. A poor harvest could spell disaster, tipping the balance from subsistence to starvation. For most people living between 500 and 1500 CE, eating was less about enjoyment and more about getting enough to survive. Where a pot simmers over an open hearth and uncover what truly nourished those who built the medieval world. Still, these communities managed to feed themselves using clever cooking methods, smart preservation, and deep knowledge of their environment. It sheds light on their connection to the land, their social systems, their tools, and even how they viewed life. If one food could sum up daily survival, from this natural in hard times, such as during the famine of 1315 to 1317, bread included ingredients like bran, bark, and dried clay, according to chronicler Jean de Venette. The line in the Lord's Prayer asking for daily bread reflected a very real concern. Bread played a role in religious rituals, folk traditions, and social customs. To share bread was to share life itself. Breaking bread together formed bonds of community and obligation. In times of scarcity, bread became even more sacred. While some details may be exaggerated, botanical evidence confirms that people resorted to unusual ingredients in desperate times. Fermentation not only helped the bread rise, but also improved its nutrition by breaking down compounds that block mineral absorption. The result was a thick-crusted, flat, and dense loaf that stored well. 13th century or 14th century household ledger, the Ménagier de Paris, outlines 3 types of bread: pain de ROI fine white bread for nobles, pain de bourgeois medium quality bread for tradesmen, and pain bis or pain noir dark bread made from coarser flour for peasants. England showed that a working man might eat 2 to 3 pounds of bread a day. That might sound excessive now, but it made sense for people doing intense physical labor. Bread was so vital that wages were sometimes measured in loaves, and prices were tightly controlled to prevent public unrest. It was bread. Its importance can't be overstated. It was truly the staff of life. Archaeological digs regularly uncover remains of bread ovens, grain storage bins, and grinding tools, showing just how central bread was to everyday life. In fact, bread often made up 70 to 80% of a peasant's calorie intake. From daily bread to foraged foods, from hearty stews to preserved supplies for winter, the medieval peasant diet reflects one of humanity's most effective responses to environmental limits and social hardship. These meals were more than nourishment. They were vital survival techniques passed down through generations. It was usually made from rye or maslin, a mix of wheat and rye producing a dark, dense bread. The grinding process left bits of grit and other particles in the flour. Oddly enough, this coarser flour was healthier, with more fiber and nutrients than modern refined flour, supplying vital minerals and vitamins. Their food choices weren't based on preference, but were deeply tied to farming practices, religious rules, and communal responsibilities. Families would prepare the dough at home but use the Lord's oven for baking, paying a fee called banalities. In villages like Wareham Percy in Yorkshire, archaeologists have found remnants of these communal ovens, which were also social gathering points. Later, many peasants built small clay or stone ovens near their homes. This was a world without refrigerators, global trade networks, or modern nutrition science. When food was available, a typical peasant might consume 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day, mainly from carbohydrates. Meals were repetitive by today's standards, with bread and pottage, a thick stew or soup, serving as staples. Meat was rare, usually reserved for holidays or used sparingly for flavor. Vegetables came from local gardens, and fresh fruit was a seasonal treat. But what medieval peasants ate reveals much more than just dietary habits. As we examine the simple meals that sustain medieval communities, we'll see a cuisine formed by necessity, but shaped by creative adaptation. Let's now enter a smoky medieval cottage, the staff of life. Bread and grains. Bread was the backbone of medieval life. Records peasant bread looked nothing like the fluffy white loaves sold in stores today. Making bread was laborious and often communal. Bread was usually leavened with sourdough, a portion of fermented dough saved from the previous batch. Bread quality reflected social class. The darkness of peasant bread came not just from rye, but also from fillers like barley, oats, peas, beans, acorns, and even tree bark. Bread wasn't only food, it held deep cultural and spiritual meaning. The line in the Lord's Prayer asking for daily bread reflected a very real concern. Bread played a role in religious rituals, folk traditions, and social customs. To share bread was to share life itself. Breaking bread together formed bonds of community and obligation. Known variously as pottage, porridge, gruel, or frumenty, depending on the ingredients and texture, these meals stretched grain supplies and filled stomachs while using minimal fuel. In times of scarcity, bread became even more sacred. It was the standard daily meal cooked in one pot over the hearth and eaten throughout the day. It's often mentioned in medieval texts as a poor person's food. The 14th century poem Piers Plowman describes the diet of the poor as bread and thin ale and a mess of pottage. Pottage, porridge, and gruel, the liquid bread many were found in peasant homes, placed directly over hearth fires, often showing signs of repeated repair. These vessels were essential for daily cooking. The cauldron, suspended over a fire using a chain or hook called a trammel, allowed cooks to adjust the heat by raising or lowering the pot. Residue analysis from medieval pots at West Cotton in Northamptonshire showed traces of barley, oats, wheat, peas, and various greens, confirming the mixed nature of these stews. Burnt food remains found at hearths across Europe reveal similar combinations. The pottage simmered throughout the day, with family members helping themselves as needed. Ingredients were often added daily, creating an ongoing meal that could last for several days. This continuous cooking method minimized fuel use, a major concern when firewood was limited or costly. If bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, porridge-like dishes were its companion. A common recipe started with oats, barley, or rye, simmered slowly with dried peas and whatever herbs or vegetables were on hand. A dish known as frumenty, made from cracked wheat cooked in milk, might be sweetened with honey during festivals or religious events, and a vehicle for consuming vegetables and herbs that might otherwise be tough to eat. The extended cooking time also improved digestion and reduced anti-nutritional compounds in the ingredients. Manor records occasionally mention small amounts of meat added to pottage on feast days or after slaughtering livestock, elevating this everyday meal into a celebration. Pottage was essentially a thick stew, mainly made from grains but including any available vegetables, herbs, or scraps of meat. Archaeological digs, like those in Warren Percy, show how central the cooking pot was. The simplest form was gruel grain boiled in water, or sometimes milk, until it reached a thin porridge-like state. Heartier pottages used a variety of ingredients. Beans and seasonal vegetables like onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, and carrots were common additions to pottage. Herbs from the garden or nearby woodlands, such as parsley, sage, garlic, and thyme, enhanced the flavor. The dish was usually thick enough to be eaten with a spoon or scooped with bread. The ingredients in pottage changed significantly with the seasons. In spring, foraged greens like young nettles and sorrel were common. Summer versions included garden vegetables and fresh herbs, while autumn pottage featured root crops and dried legumes. During winter, stored grains, preserved vegetables, and dried peas were key. This seasonal rotation not only added variety, but also supported a more balanced diet throughout the year. Cooking methods were both clever and efficient. Archaeological studies shed light on these cooking habits. On special occasions, or in slightly wealthier homes, pottage was enriched with more luxurious ingredients. Nutritionally, these grain-based dishes were essential. They provided energy from complex carbohydrates, protein from legumes, and a vehicle for consuming vegetables and herbs that might otherwise be tough to eat. The extended cooking time also improved digestion and reduced anti-nutritional compounds in the ingredients. Pottage was so central to daily life that it became a symbol of basic sustenance. The English word pottage shares its roots with pottage and pot, reflecting its preparation method. When the biblical Esau gave up his birthright for a mess of pottage, medieval listeners would have understood it as an everyday, humble meal, making the act all the more shocking. Barley, oats, and millet were more affordable, hardy, and crucial for survival in many regions. Even poor households often malted part of their barley harvest to make ale. This wasn't just for enjoyment. Ale was a key source of calories and safer to drink than possibly contaminated water. A basic oat porridge was made by boiling oats in water or milk, a tradition that continues today. Oat cakes, made from oatmeal, water, and salt, were cooked on hot stones and could be stored for days, making them convenient for field work. Records from 14th century England show that adults might consume a gallon or more of weak ale each day. Excavations in medieval Poland, Hungary, France, and Italy show millet as a staple among the lower classes. In Eastern Europe, it was sometimes fermented into a mildly alcoholic drink similar to kvass. The upper classes often looked down on these grains, favoring white wheat bread. This bias appears in medieval literature. The 12th century writer Alexander Neckham noted that barley bread is fit for horses, but men eat it when forced by famine. Turnips, carrots, and parsnips were key to survival for multiple reasons. They grew well in poor soil, could be stored through winter, and provided essential calories and nutrients when grain was limited. Still, these grains were rich in protein, fiber, and micronutrients, often more so than the refined wheat flour favored by elites. It had advantages like rapid growth, low water needs, and the ability to grow in marginal soil. It could even be planted after other crops failed. Brewing, typically handled by women known as alewives, produced a low-alcohol drink rich in B vitamins and energy. It required less fertile soil and could grow in high altitudes and wet conditions. Agricultural manuals and household guides provided instructions for using them effectively. This adaptability shows how peasants used their knowledge to survive changing conditions. The 14th century Tuscan author Pietro di Crescenzi recommended mixing millet with small amounts of wheat during food shortages, saying it nourishes little but fills the belly. Though it could be baked into bread, barley's low gluten content made leavening difficult. More often, it was used for pottage, flatbreads, or bannocks, simple unleavened breads cooked on griddles or flat stones. Excavations at the village of Halter on Dartmoor uncovered several such baking surfaces, highlighting this method's importance. Alternative grains, millet, barley, and oats, while wheat and rye were most common in bread making. Other grains played vital roles, especially in areas where growing wheat was difficult. Barley was especially important in northern and mountainous areas. Evidence from medieval sites in Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Alps shows barley as a primary crop. In these places, oats were often the main grain. The 16th century Scottish historian Hector Boyce observed that the common people lived on oat cakes and oat pottage mixed with peas or beans. Archaeological findings confirm this, with oat remains and processing tools frequently found in Scottish sites. Barley was also essential for brewing beer. Oats thrived in the cooler, damp areas of northern Europe, especially Scotland, Ireland, and Scandinavia. Oats were rarely made into bread. Instead, they were typically cooked into porridge or baked into oat cakes. Millet was vital in Central and Eastern Europe and in areas with poor soil. Although unfamiliar in modern Western diets, millet was a lifeline for many peasants. Millet was typically eaten as porridge or flat cakes. During times of famine, knowing how to cook with these grains was crucial. Archaeological evidence from medieval latrines, dating to the famine of 1315 to 1317, reveals increased oat and barley consumption, even in areas where wheat was normally preferred. Vegetables and legumes. The garden's contribution: root vegetables, turnips, carrots, and parsnips. Root crops were the foundation of medieval plant-based diets. Turnips, carrots, and parsnips were key to survival for multiple reasons. They grew well in poor soil, could be stored through winter, and provided essential calories and nutrients when grain was limited. Turnips stood out as especially important in Northern Europe. Archaeological digs frequently uncover turnip seeds and pollen at rural sites, showing their widespread cultivation. Turnips grew quickly and could be planted after the grain harvest, effectively doubling land use. Preparation methods included boiling or roasting, often adding them to pottage or mashing them with other vegetables. Botanical remains and medieval illustrations show purple, white, and yellow varieties. The orange carrot was only developed in the Netherlands in the 17th century. Storage techniques were simple yet effective. Root cellars, underground chambers that maintained a cool, humid environment, were ideal for preserving these crops. Though medieval people lacked modern knowledge of vitamins, these foods provided essential nutrients, particularly vitamin C, helping prevent deficiency diseases during winter. And meals made with pottage, parsnips, and turnips. Despite their low social status, these vegetables were critical to survival. Hardy and productive, these vegetables were staples in peasant gardens. Cabbage appeared frequently in medieval records and archaeology. The Germanic term kohl, referring to cabbage, appears in many location names. Folklore attributes medicinal uses to cabbage leaves, and seeds sown on saints' days were thought to yield better crops. Archaeological evidence, including seeds found in waste deposits, confirms cabbage's dietary role. At Weststow in Suffolk, significant quantities of brassica seeds were identified, showing these plants were everyday staples. Unlike today's tight-headed cabbages, medieval varieties were loose-leaf, similar to collard greens. This allowed for ongoing harvesting without killing the plant, ensuring a steady supply of greens. Analysis of heritage vegetables, similar to those grown in the Middle Ages, indicates they may have had higher nutrient content than today's varieties. Root vegetables were especially crucial during the hunger gap in late spring when stored food ran low and new crops were not yet ready. Historical court records reference thefts of stored roots during this time, highlighting their significance. Excavations at Warham Percy in Yorkshire revealed such a cellar containing straw-layered turnips and parsnips, showcasing medieval preservation methods. Another storage solution, the clamp, involved piling root vegetables outdoors and insulating them with straw and soil. This method required no infrastructure, making it accessible to poorer peasants. Evidence of clamps is often found in distinctive pits near medieval homes. Earlier carrots were thinner, woodier, and had a more intense flavor. During severe shortages, turnips were sometimes dried and ground into flour to stretch limited grain supplies, a method recorded during the famines of the early 1300s. In a 13th century farming guide, Walter of Henley praised turnips as both food for people and fodder for animals, helping sustain households during hard times. The medieval turnip differed from today's common varieties. Historical evidence suggests it was larger, less uniform, often white, and had a stronger, more bitter taste. Carrots in the medieval period were also quite different from the modern orange ones. Modern varieties of root vegetables, though often more mild, were once more bitter and robust in flavor. Despite these differences, they were highly valued for their long shelf life and versatility. Parsnips, with their higher sugar and calorie content, were especially appreciated in northern regions where short growing seasons made reliable nutrition a challenge. They became even sweeter after exposure to frost, offering vital winter sustenance. Archaeological findings from villages in England, Germany, and Scandinavia confirm widespread cultivation, with parsnip seeds found in numerous household waste deposits. Root vegetables were sown in late spring or early summer and harvested in autumn before the ground froze. Nutritionally, these vegetables played a vital role. Root vegetables were often seen as humble fare. In 14th century literature such as Piers Plowman, peasants are described as living on bread. Ale, cabbage, kale, and other leafy greens were equally essential throughout the growing season. Their importance is echoed in place names and traditions across Europe. The Germanic term Kohl, referring to cabbage, appears in many location names. Folklore attributes medicinal uses to cabbage leaves, and seeds sown on saints' days were thought to yield better crops. Archaeological evidence, including seeds found in waste deposits, confirms cabbage's dietary role. In colder climates, fermentation was used, giving rise to sauerkraut and similar foods. Pottery vessels designed to hold fermenting cabbage have been found across Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia, often with residue confirming this usage. These vegetables offered significant health benefits, notably preventing scurvy and aiding digestion. Archaeological, written, and artistic records consistently show their widespread cultivation and use across social classes. Medieval onions were generally smaller and more pungent than modern ones. They also featured in folk remedies. Garlic and leeks in particular were believed to ward off illness. Their dual use made them indispensable in both the kitchen and the medicine chest. Various types existed, including small pearl onions and larger storage varieties. Pietro de Crescenzi, a 13th century agricultural author, documented these in his writings. Onions were likely the most common, with remains found at many sites, including dried skins preserved in ideal conditions. At Warham Percy, storage areas within homes contained onions, indicating their importance. Root vegetables, leafy greens, and alliums offer more than sustenance. They represented ingenuity, adaptation, and survival in a challenging world. Heritage varieties often had higher nutrient levels than modern breeds. Preservation methods were simple but effective. Root cellars, underground chambers that maintained a cool, humid climate helped extend shelf life. Excavations at Warham Percy in Yorkshire revealed such a cellar containing straw-layered turnips and parsnips, demonstrating medieval preservation practices. Another common method, the clamp, involved piling root vegetables outdoors and insulating them with straw and soil. Clamps needed no infrastructure, making them accessible to poorer households. Evidence of clamps often appears as distinctive pits near medieval homes. At Weststow in Suffolk, significant quantities of brassica seeds were identified, showing these plants were everyday staples. Kale was especially important in colder regions. Its resistance to frost meant it could provide fresh greens even during winter. Medieval kale grew taller and hardier than modern types. In literature and speech, references to cabbage gardens often imply modesty or insignificance. Yet these vegetables helped sustain communities in both good times and bad. Despite these differences, they were prized for their long shelf life and versatility. Parsnips, with their higher sugar and calorie content, were especially valued in northern areas where short growing seasons made dependable nutrition difficult. Exposure to frost made them even sweeter, offering vital sustenance in winter. Archaeological finds in villages across England, Germany, and Scandinavia confirm their widespread cultivation, with parsnip seeds recovered from numerous household waste deposits. Cultivation practices included sowing seedlings in protected beds early in spring and transplanting them once frost danger passed, as described in Pietro de Crescenzi's early 14th century Ruralia Commota. While elite cookbooks feature more elaborate preparations, such as parboiling cabbage and finishing it with fat, peasants usually cooked them simply, perhaps with a bit of bacon or just salt. Other leafy greens, including spinach, beet greens, chard, and auric, were also used. Spinach arrived via Islamic Spain and gradually moved northward. These greens added diversity to the diet but were harder to store. For winter preservation, hardy greens were left in the ground for harvesting as needed. Cabbage and kale were typically boiled or added to pottage. Though often viewed as low-status foods, cabbage and kale were nutritional pillars for the peasantry. Onions, leeks, and garlic, members of the allium family, held a dual role in the medieval diet, serving both as flavor enhancers and medicinal aids. Unlike highly seasonal vegetables, onions could be stored through much of the year with simple drying or cool storage. These vegetables were crucial in everyday meals and added much-needed flavor to pottage and other simple dishes. In sum, the medieval peasant diet, though limited in luxury, was rich in resourcefulness. Modern varieties of root vegetables, though often milder in flavor, were once more robust and bitter. Root vegetables were sown in late spring or early summer and harvested in autumn before the ground froze. Preservation methods were simple but effective. Root cellars, underground chambers that maintained a cool, humid climate, helped extend shelf life. Excavations at Warham Percy in Yorkshire revealed such a cellar containing straw-layered turnips and parsnips, demonstrating medieval preservation practices. Another common method, the clamp, involved piling root vegetables outdoors and insulating them with straw and soil. Despite their humble reputation, these vegetables were critical for survival. Clamps needed no infrastructure, making them accessible to poorer households. Evidence of clamps often appears as distinctive pits near medieval homes. The Germanic term cole, referring to cabbage, is found in many place names. Folklore held that cabbage had medicinal benefits, and seeds planted on saints' days were thought to yield better crops. Archaeological evidence, including seeds from waste deposits, confirms cabbage's importance. At Weststow in Suffolk, a large quantity of brassica seeds was identified, indicating these greens were everyday staples. Nutritionally, these vegetables were essential. Although medieval people didn't understand vitamins, root vegetables provided crucial nutrients like vitamin C, helping prevent deficiencies in winter. Studies of heritage vegetables, similar to medieval strains, suggest they had higher nutrient content than modern types. These vegetables were particularly important during the Hunger Gap, in late spring when stored food ran low and new crops had not yet matured. Historical court records even mention thefts of stored roots during this time, showing their high value. Root vegetables were considered modest fare. In 14th century texts like Piers Plowman, peasants are depicted living on bread, ale, and meals of pottage, parsnips, and turnips. Cabbage, kale, and other leafy greens were equally essential during the growing season. Hardy and prolific, they were staples in peasant gardens. Cabbage appears frequently in both written and archaeological records. Unlike modern varieties with tight heads, medieval cabbages were loose-leaf, more like collard greens, allowing ongoing harvesting without uprooting the plant and ensuring a steady food supply. Their significance is reflected in place names and traditions across Europe. The Germanic term cole, referring to cabbage, is found in many place names. Folklore held that cabbage had medicinal benefits, and seeds planted on saints' days were thought to yield better crops. Archaeological evidence, including seeds from waste deposits, confirms cabbage's importance. At Weststow in Suffolk, a large quantity of brassica seeds was identified, indicating these greens were everyday staples. Kale was particularly valuable in colder climates. Its resistance to frost allowed for fresh greens even in winter. Medieval kale varieties were taller and hardier than today's. In colder areas, fermentation preserved greens, leading to foods like sauerkraut. Medieval onions were generally smaller and more pungent than those today. Different types existed, including pearl onions and larger varieties meant for storage. Hardier than onions, they could remain in the ground through winter, offering fresh vegetables when few others were available. Archaeological finds of leek seeds and pollen in medieval garden sites, such as at Coppergate in York, suggest their widespread use among ordinary households. Leeks became a national symbol of Wales, reportedly dating back to a 640 CE battle, where soldiers wore them in their helmets for identification. By the medieval period, leeks were firmly established as a dietary staple and cultural marker in Wales and northern Britain. Petro de Crescenzi, a 13th century agricultural writer, documented these kinds in his work, while elite cookbooks included more elaborate recipes, such as boiling cabbage and finishing it with fat. Peasants typically prepared them simply, sometimes with a bit of bacon or just salt. Garlic and leeks were especially valued for their health benefits and believed to help prevent illness. Their practical and medicinal roles made them indispensable in both cooking and healing. Other leafy greens like spinach, beet greens, chard, and auric were also used. Spinach, introduced via Islamic Spain, gradually moved northward. These greens added variety to the diet but were harder to preserve. Pottery vessels designed for fermenting cabbage have been found across Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia, often with residue confirming their purpose. In literature and conversation, references to cabbage gardens often imply modesty or low status. Yet these greens sustain communities in both good times and bad. These greens offered substantial health benefits, including protection against scurvy and digestive support. Heritage varieties often had higher nutrient levels than modern types. Cultivation methods included sowing seedlings in sheltered beds early in spring and transplanting them after frost pass, as described in Pietro de Crescenzi's 14th century Ruralia Comoda. For winter use, hardy greens were left in the ground and harvested as needed. Cabbage and kale were usually boiled or added to pottage. Archaeological, written, and artistic evidence shows their widespread cultivation and use across social groups. Onions were likely the most commonly grown, with remains found at many sites, including dried skins preserved in ideal conditions. At Warham Percy, storage areas inside homes held onions, highlighting their importance. Though often viewed as lower-class fare, cabbage and kale were nutritional mainstays for peasants. Onions, leeks, and garlic, members of the allium family, played a dual role in the medieval diet, providing both flavor and medicinal benefits. Unlike highly seasonal produce, onions could be stored for much of the year with simple drying or cool storage. These vegetables were crucial in daily meals and brought essential flavor to simple dishes like pottage. They were also used in traditional remedies. Leeks, in particular, held cultural importance in Welsh and Northern European diets. Hardier than onions, they could remain in the ground through winter, offering fresh vegetables when few others were available. Archaeological finds of leek seeds and pollen in medieval garden sites, such as at Coppergate in York, suggest their widespread use among ordinary households. Archaeological finds include cloves and bulb fragments from various sites. They were usually propagated by planting bulbs rather than seeds, allowing peasants to maintain their own stock without needing to buy new seed. Mature onions and garlic, dried thoroughly after late summer harvest, could last for months. Excavations at peasant homes often reveal storage areas where strings of onions and garlic once hung from rafters. Before antibiotics, their natural antimicrobial properties made them go-to remedies for common illnesses. In folklore, garlic was believed to repel evil and disease beliefs, partially supported by its antimicrobial properties. Onions were sometimes thought to predict weather. Thicker skins were said to signal a harsh winter. These beliefs reinforced the importance of alliums and ensured their continued cultivation. Despite or perhaps because of their pungent smell, alliums were associated with peasant life. Medieval literature and art often linked their strong odor to lower-class identity. Archaeological evidence from the abandoned village of Warham Percy includes cheese molds with perforations for draining wave-proof of domestic cheesemaking. Yet, these unassuming vegetables added vital nutrition and flavor to the peasant diet, transforming basic fare into satisfying meals while offering protection from illness. These resemble today's cottage cheese, farmer's cheese, or lightly pressed varieties, rather than aged cheeses. The most basic forms, often called green, white, or fresh cheese, could be made in a day and eaten within weeks. Pressed and salted cheeses, if properly stored, could last through the winter. Medieval medical texts consistently endorsed their use for coughs, colds, and digestive issues. Churns and vessels used for making butter are commonly found in medieval peasant sites. At Rattray in Scotland, a well-preserved wooden churn was discovered in waterlogged soil, offering a rare glimpse into the tools of the time. This suggests that fresh milk, though seasonally available, was not a staple in the peasant diet mainly because it spoiled quickly in warmer weather due to the lack of refrigeration. Archaeological finds from cesspits sometimes show higher allium remains during winter, hinting at increased consumption for health during flu season. Another method involved chopping and drying them into shelf-stable seasoning. In Mediterranean regions, onions were sometimes preserved in vinegar or brine, creating pickled condiments that enhanced winter meals. This made alliums particularly valuable in the subsistence-based economy of medieval villages. The 14th century household manual, Le Ménager de Paris, even noted that milk was of little value unless turned into cheese. Estate records often list dairy among the rents peasants owed to their lords, including annual contributions of cheese or butter. Documents like the Doomsday Book and later estate surveys detail these dairy rents, offering insight into expected production. This reflects the practical reality. Transforming perishable milk into cheese extended its shelf life and ensured year-round availability of dairy-based nutrition. Garlic was prized for its ability to preserve food and its wide-ranging medical uses. Medieval medical texts consistently recommended garlic for treating ailments from respiratory infections to parasites. As flavor enhancers, they gave depth to otherwise bland pottages and stews. A small amount of chopped onion or leek could elevate a simple grain porridge. Alliums were also used with herbs and stuffings for meat dishes on feast days. The 14th century English cookbook, The Form of Cury, includes many recipes using onions and leeks, indicating their use across social classes. The 12th century Salernitan Regimen of Health advised drinking fresh milk to counter garlic's side effects. Leeks became a national symbol of Wales, reportedly dating back to a 640 CE battle, where soldiers wore them in their helmets for identification. By the medieval period, leeks were firmly established as a dietary staple and cultural marker in Wales and northern Britain. Garlic, with its strong flavor and potent medicinal properties, was grown in peasant gardens throughout Europe. Alliums suited peasant farming well. They grew easily in small plots, required little maintenance, and performed reliably even in poor soils. Preservation techniques included simple storage in dry, cool places. Alliums had diverse culinary uses in peasant cooking. Medicinally, alliums were essential. Their social and cultural roles extended beyond their practical uses. Archaeological findings show that medieval cooking vessels contained higher concentrations of milk fats during the summer months. More crucially, turning milk into cheese or butter allowed it to last much longer. For peasants who owned cows, milk was typically used in three ways: direct consumption, cheese production, and fulfilling manorial dues. Cheese-making became an essential household skill. It enabled families to preserve milk in a durable form, sustaining them through winter months when cows ceased lactating. Peasant cheeses were generally fresh and simple, made from cow, goat, or sheep milk, depending on the region. Butter was another key dairy product, valued for its fat content in a diet often lacking sufficient calories. Churns and vessels used for making butter are commonly found in medieval peasant sites. At Rattray in Scotland, a well-preserved wooden churn was discovered in waterlogged soil, offering a rare glimpse into the tools of the time. During Lent and religious fasting days, butter was technically forbidden, though archaeological findings show that adherence to these rules varied by region and circumstance. Both archaeological and documentary records point to shared pastureland and cooperative cheese-making facilities. Without refrigeration, butter was usually heavily salted or clarified through heating, similar to modern ghee, to prevent spoilage. It was used sparingly as a cooking fat or spread. Cheese and butter supplied fats, fat-soluble vitamins, calcium, and complete proteins nutrients otherwise lacking in a grain and vegetable-heavy diet. These contributions helped prevent nutritional deficiencies. Even peasants without livestock could access dairy. Communal herds were common in many villages, allowing people to pool animals and receive a share of the milk or cheese. The Bishop of Winchester's 13th century estate accounts document many such payments. Unlike meat, which required more resources, chickens offered a low-cost, sustainable protein source even for poorer households. In alpine areas, where pastoral farming was more practical than crop growing, dairy played a larger role in daily nutrition. Excavations at numerous rural sites, including Wareham Percy in Yorkshire, have uncovered chicken bones, eggshell fragments, and remnants of enclosures indicating widespread poultry keeping. Yet archaeological evidence suggests these restrictions were not always followed, especially among peasants. Unlike cows or pigs, they didn't compete for grain or require dedicated pasture. Chickens also provided meat, feathers for bedding, and manure for gardening. They laid far fewer eggs, perhaps 60 to 80 a year, compared to today's commercial hens, which can lay over 250. But they were hardy, fed themselves by foraging, and didn't require special care. Vitamins. Church records occasionally mention distributing eggs after Easter services, underscoring their ritual importance. And minerals like iron and selenium. These nutrients were vital in a mostly plant-based diet. This created cycles of abundance and scarcity. Archaeological layers reflect this trend, with higher concentrations of eggshells in warm season deposits. During peak seasons, eggs added much-needed protein to the diet. The 100 Rolls of 1279, a large survey of English landholdings, includes many cases where tenants paid dozens or hundreds of eggs annually, showing that poultry was common even in modest homes. These references hint at simpler versions likely eaten by peasants. Excavations in 14th century Leicester uncovered ceramic vessels containing eggshells and mineral deposits consistent with lime preservation. Hard-boiled eggs were also pickled in vinegar or brine. As detailed in manuals like Le Ménagier de Paris, residue analysis of pots used during fasting periods often reveals dairy traces, indicating that survival needs sometimes outweighed strict observance. These settlements often show more advanced equipment and storage for cheese. In contrast, in Central Europe's grain-focused regions, dairy was consumed less frequently and in smaller quantities. Labor payments also provided access to dairy. Manor records show that cheese or butter was often given as partial compensation for seasonal agricultural work, such as haymaking or harvest. Nutritionally, even small amounts of dairy significantly improved the peasant diet. Dairy consumption varied across regions. Religious customs also shaped dairy use. Church fasting rules banned milk, cheese, and butter alongside meat during Lent. Eggs, a reliable source of protein. Eggs provided a widely accessible source of high-quality protein. Chickens, capable of producing eggs with minimal feed, were commonly kept by medieval peasants. Written records support these findings. Feudal documents often list eggs among the rents owed by tenants. However, medieval chickens were smaller and leaner than modern breeds. Chicken keeping integrated well into peasant life. These birds needed little space and converted scraps and insects into valuable food. Egg production followed a seasonal pattern, peaking in spring and summer and dropping during winter. Medieval cookbooks, though primarily focused on elite households, include various egg preparations, from simple boiled eggs to combinations with bread or vegetables. Preservation techniques helped extend egg availability. Methods included storing them in lime water, salt brine, or ash to seal the porous shells. Nutritional analysis confirms the value of eggs. Even in small amounts, they deliver complete protein, essential fatty acids. Eggs also held cultural and religious significance. They symbolize renewal, especially at Easter, the end of Lent.
Church records occasionally mention distributing eggs after Easter services, underscoring their ritual importance. Economically, eggs were more than just food. They were easily traded, making them a key resource for peasant households. Market records from towns show eggs were frequently sold or bartered, often managed by women. Environmental factors like climate shaped laying Psychoscoda regions saw reduced winter production, while Mediterranean areas had more consistent year-round yields. Poultry and egg sales gave women a rare degree of economic independence in a male-dominated society. Egg consumption also varied by region. In grain-based areas, eggs were often the main animal protein, while in pastoral regions, dairy played a more prominent role. Though likely eaten in small amounts, they were nutritionally essential, especially in a diet otherwise dominated by plant-based food. While fresh fish was often too expensive for most peasants, preserveriases offered a practical and accessible alternative, even for communities far from large waters. Often overlooked in discussions of medieval diets, eggs were, in reality, a vital and dependable source of nutrition for the peasant class. Excavations in medieval fishing villages uncovered a variety of fishing tools, net weights, hooks, and woven traps, indicating that ordinary people engaged in small-scale fishing. Coastal communities had access to a wide range of marine, while inland peasants relied on freshwater species or imported preserved marine fish. These oily fish were easy to catch in vast numbers during their migrations and could be preserved efficiently. Herring remains are among the most common fish bones found in peasant settlements across northern Europe. Historical documents revealed that by the 14th century, millions of herring were caught each year and distributed widely as preserved goods. For example, herring bones dominate coastal sites in Scandinavia and the Baltic, while Central European inland sites show more freshwater species like pike, perch, and carp. Monasteries often built fish ponds for consistent supply, and these sometimes became communal assets. Excavations at monastic sites reveal complex pond systems with signs of fish management. By the later Middle Ages, such ponds also appeared on manorial estates and occasionally in peasant villages, offering access to fresh fish. Sites like Meols on the Warrell Peninsula yielded boats, net weights, and fish processing areas, showing localized fishing activity. Archaeological and documentary sources consistently demonstrate that eggs were not rare treats, but regular elements in the peasant diet. Fish, whether fresh, dried, salted, smoked, or fermented, was another crucial protein source, particularly for peasants living near the coast, rivers, or lakes. And during religious fasting periods when meat was restricted, archaeological traces of fermented fish production include barrels and pits with distinct chemical residues. The significance of fish in medieval diets was reinforced by Catholic dietary rules. Air drying worked well in cold climates, and archaeologists have found structures for drying cod and other whitefish in Norway and Iceland. Salting was common for fatty fish like herring, with evidence of salt storage and layering techniques at various sites. Records from medieval towns list preserved fish as a staple, often affordable even to lower-income buyers. Memorial accounts also document its use as a portable, protein-rich food during harvest or labor-intensive seasons. Soaking was required before eating salted fish to reduce its salt content. Nearly half the year consisted of fast days when meat from land animals was forbidden. Fish bones found in household waste, such as at the abandoned medieval village of Warren Percy in Yorkshire, confirmed consumption in inland areas, suggesting preserved fish was transported from the coast. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains further supports a diet including marine protein, even at sites far from the sea. During these times, fish became the main allowed source of animal protein. Wealthier individuals might afford fresh fish even inland. But for peasants, preserved fish was more common due to its transportability and long shelf life. Evidence of fish consumption among peasants comes from multiple sources. For communities closer to water, fresh fish was more available. The types of fish eaten varied widely by region and accessibility. Herring, in particular, played a central role in the medieval diet. Preservation was key to making fish available across the continent. Fermentation, particularly common in Scandinavia, produced potent products like Swedish surströmming and Norwegian rakes. Peasants usually didn't preserve fish themselves. Instead, they acquired it through markets or trade. Religious fasts didn't just increase demand, they encouraged infrastructure that made fish more widely available.
Peasants consumed different parts of animals than elites. While the wealthy chose prime cuts, ordinary people used nearly all edible portions, organs, heads, feet, and even blood. Bones from these parts are frequently found at peasant sites, highlighting their resourceful approach to meat consumption. This suggests the consumption of animal heads and feet parts typically discarded by wealthier households. Blood, tripe, lungs, and other organ meats were central to peasant diets, offering nutrition without requiring long-term animal feeding. These so-called fifth quarter foods rarely left archaeological traces, but appear in written records. Modern nutritional science shows that meat provided not only protein, but also vital micronutrients, especially iron, zinc, and B vitamins like B12 that are hard to obtain from a plant-based diet. Archaeological evidence suggests that while meat consumption declined during these times, it did not disappear, especially in rural areas. In upland regions less suited for growing grains, pastoral farming dominated, and meat played a larger role in the diet. Excavations from mountainous areas in Wales, Scotland, and the Alps show higher quantities of animal bones compared to lowland villages. In contrast, peasants in fertile agricultural zones had limited meat access, with animal products supplementing rather than forming the basis of meals. These supplemented their diets with essential nutrients, medicinal properties, and flavor. At Wareham Percy in Yorkshire, botanical analysis revealed wild greens like nettles, fathen, sorrel, and dandelion. Similar findings occur throughout Europe, with species varying by region. Found in many archaeological samples, these plants were rich in iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C nutrients, often lacking in early spring. Cooking neutralized their stinging hairs, producing a spinach-like green used in stews or as a side dish. The knowledge required to identify, harvest, and prepare wild plants represented an intricate ecological understanding passed down through generations. A cousin of quinoa, this plant thrived in disturbed soil near settlements and offered more protein than many leafy greens. Its popularity turned it from a weed into a valuable food source. Spring was particularly important, offering fresh greens after the long winter. Both archaeological and documentary sources show increased gathering during this time. The 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen noted that spring greens help purify the blood, an early understanding of their health benefits following winter scarcity. Studies of seasonal food remains show a decrease in meat during fasting periods, but not complete abstinence. In a food system otherwise dominated by grains and vegetables, occasional meat intake helped prevent nutrient deficiencies. A 14th century household manual, Le Ménagier de Paris, includes recipes for blood puddings and organ-based dishes, highlighting their common use among ordinary people. Archaeological evidence shows different patterns of animal remains during seasonal festivals or life events like weddings. The types of animals consumed also shifted. Pig bones are commonly associated with Christmas and winter feasts, while lamb appears more frequently around Easter. Excavations of medieval village sites have revealed a disproportionately high number of skull fragments and foot bones in peasant middens. Hunting provided another possible source of meat, though access was heavily restricted by forest laws that reserved wild game for the nobility. Archaeological findings consistently show chicken bones in peasant waste, typically from older birds no longer laying eggs. It appeared on their tables infrequently, in small amounts, and often as parts rejected by the wealthy. This occasional, waste-conscious approach to meat consumption proved efficient, providing nutritional benefits while using fewer resources, a model that resonates in modern discussions about sustainable food systems. Manorial records sometimes mention poultry as part of rents paid by peasants, indicating widespread chicken keeping. Geese appear less often, but were raised in some households, particularly where grazing land was available. Despite these limitations, archaeological evidence from peasant sites occasionally includes bones from wild animals, particularly small species like rabbits, hares, and birds likely caught with simple traps or snares. The frequency of such remains varies by region and period, reflecting how strictly hunting laws were enforced. Court documents record many cases of peasants punished for poaching, indirectly confirming that some were willing to risk penalties to include wild game in their diets. Domestic poultry, especially chickens, offered a more accessible meat source than larger animals. Even limited meat consumption significantly contributed to medieval peasant nutrition. Religious rules further complicated meat consumption. Catholic dietary regulations prohibited meat on Fridays, during Lent, and on numerous fasting days, altogether nearly half the calendar year. Regional patterns in meat consumption reflected local farming systems and environments. Meat's cultural value extended beyond nutrition. Special occasions and feast days often feature meat, even in poorer households. Though meat was a luxury, it was not completely out of reach for medieval peasants. In addition to meat, peasants relied heavily on gathered and foraged foods, wild greens and herbs from surrounding landscapes. Most evidence of wild plant use comes from the analysis of plant remains seeds, pollen, and occasionally preserved tissues found in household waste, cesspits, and cooking containers. The seasonal nature of wild plant gathering aligned with the agricultural calendar. Nettles were among the most important wild greens in the medieval diet. Fat hen, also known as lamb's quarters or goosefoot, was another staple. Botanical remains show its widespread use. Some plants, like good King Henry, were so prized that they were moved closer to homes, blurring the line between wild and cultivated. Dandelions, too, were used extensively, leaves for salads or cooking, flowers for wine, and roots for medicine or coffee-like drinks. Their bitter compounds were thought to aid digestion, showing how food and medicine often overlapped. Sorrel added a lemony tang to bland dishes and had practical uses too. Its oxalic acid could curdle milk in cheese making when rennet was unavailable. Wild alliums like ramsons and field garlic supplemented cultivated varieties, offering both flavor and antimicrobial benefits that may have helped prevent foodborne illness. Archaeological findings from gardens and households show herbs like mint, thyme, sage, and rosemary. Archaeological evidence includes drying structures and sometimes even dried plant remains in sealed storage areas. Modern studies show they contain high levels of vitamins, minerals, and beneficial compounds, often more than cultivated vegetables. Southern peasants gathered different species than those in the north, while Eastern Europeans used plants unknown in the west. This diversity created distinct local cuisines within the broader patterns of peasant diet. Plant remains from different regions consistently reflect this variation. Nettles, for example, have more iron than spinach and more calcium than milk by weight. Herbs like St. John's wort, mugwort, and some mushrooms have both practical and mystical uses. Historical records from such periods show an increased dependence on foraged plants, including those not typically part of the regular diet. Over generations, communities developed an intricate understanding of their local environments, which became a vital, though often overlooked, part of their survival strategies. Archaeological findings from known famine eras support these accounts, revealing a wider variety of wild plant remains and household waste. These were gathered from forests, hedgerows, commons, and loosely managed orchards, blending the boundaries between cultivated and wild food sources. For example, during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, chronicles describe people resorting to consuming tree bark and unusual roots. High in protein, fats, and calories, they were a dense and storable food source. Archaeological sites sometimes yield not only nutshells, but also nut-cracking tools, highlighting their dietary significance. Excavations at sites like the abandoned medieval village of Wareham Percy in Yorkshire have uncovered fruit stones, nutshells, and berry seeds in domestic waste, indicating regular use. Finds include crab apples, sloes, blackberries, elderberries, hazelnuts, and walnuts. While these accounts may be somewhat exaggerated, they point to a real expansion of foraging during desperate times. Despite occasional disapproval, archaeological finds show that such plants were still used, suggesting that practicality often took precedence over religious concerns. Differentiating between edible species and their toxic counterparts, recognizing the best times to harvest, and applying correct preparation methods were essential skills, often the difference between life and death. This expertise was usually transmitted orally across generations of women, forming a parallel, yet largely undocumented system of knowledge critical to community survival. In a diet lacking in variety, these wild foods help prevent deficiencies. Some greens were fermented, much like sauerkraut. Residue analysis from ceramic vessels occasionally shows signs of fermentation. These added flavor and served medicinal purposes, particularly valuable in homes with limited access to formal health care. Beyond these common greens, archaeological and written sources confirm that dozens of other wild plants were consumed. This gendered knowledge when and how to gather, how to prepare created a deep understanding of plants that endured across generations, even if rarely documented. Species like chickweed, plantain, and pellitory varied by region. Many plants now considered weeds were once important food sources. Studies of preserved feces show multiple wild plant species in single samples, confirming their regular use. Gathering wild greens was typically done by women, often alongside other tasks like collecting firewood or tending animals. Wild herbs were also used, both gathered and cultivated. Preserving greens for all-season use involved various methods. Drying was the simplest. Herbs and leaves were hung to air dry. Wild greens made a substantial nutritional contribution. The use of wild plants varied by region, reflecting local ecologies and traditions. The medieval church sometimes regarded wild plant gathering with suspicion, especially when associated with plants tied to pre-Christian beliefs, religious concerns, and daily food practices. The ability to safely identify and use wild plants required an advanced form of ecological knowledge. During famines or crop failures, this knowledge became even more vital. Collecting wild greens and herbs was more than a dietary supplement. It was a flexible, adaptive strategy essential for food security, particularly when cultivated crops failed. Nuts, berries, and fruits, wild and semi-wild fruits, nuts, and berries added nutritional value, variety, and occasional sweetness to a diet mainly based on grains and vegetables. Archaeological evidence of their consumption comes from seeds, pits, and shells that often survive in soil. Hazelnuts were among the most important wild nuts across Europe. Walnuts and chestnuts were especially important in southern and central Europe. In some regions of France, Italy, and Spain, chestnuts were so vital they nearly became staple foods. Isotopic analysis of human remains from these areas often shows dietary patterns consistent with heavy chestnut consumption, especially in summer and early fall. Archaeobotanical data consistently includes seeds from blackberries. These were often cooked or fermented into beverages like cider or perry. Archaeological finds include fruit pits, specialized presses, and ceramic vessels with fermentation residues. Elderberries, the flowers flavored drinks and desserts, while the berries were turned into syrups and wine. Rich in vitamin C up to 20 times more than oranges, they were dried or turned into syrup to help prevent scurvy during winter months. Excavations occasionally uncover remnants of such orchards. Pollen studies reveal higher concentrations of fruit tree pollen than naturally expected, indicating deliberate planning. Documents like manorial records and wills sometimes list fruit trees as valued property. Modern science validates elderberries' immune-boosting effects, indicating their traditional use had real health benefits, especially during winter. Bilberries, for example. Mediterranean peasants had access to different species than those in Northern Europe. The practice combined deep ecological understanding with effective preservation techniques and formed a critical part of the survival toolkit for medieval peasants. Eastern European forests were especially rich in berries and nuts, contributing more significantly to local diets. Archaeological studies confirm these regional variations. Forests were often owned by nobles or the church, but customary rights allowed peasants to gather certain foods seasonally. The practice of pannage, which permitted pigs to forage for acorns and nuts, also indirectly supported human diets. Court records from the period occasionally reveal disputes over these rights, emphasizing their importance and the tensions they created. Written records, herbals, household guides, and cookbooks offer more explicit evidence. The 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen describes several mushroom types in her medical texts, noting both benefits and risks. By the 15th century, cookbooks like Du Fate de Cuisine featured mushroom recipes, including for morels, reflecting broader culinary acceptance. These protein-rich forest foods offered both flavor and nutritional diversity, especially in wooded areas. However, because mushrooms decompose quickly, they rarely survive archaeologically, and others. At medieval forest-edge settlements, distinctive curved knives similar to modern mushroom knives have been found, indicating targeted harvesting practices. In some cases, modern nutritional analysis shows they supply key vitamins, minerals, healthy fats, and antioxidants, nutrients largely missing from grain-heavy diets. Rose hips and elderberries help prevent vitamin C deficiencies, while nuts added protein, vitamin E, and essential fatty acids. Analysis late summer and autumn were peak harvest periods, followed by intense activity to store these resources. Household waste from autumn often contains more fruit pits and nutshells, reflecting the seasonal cycle. Of human feces from cesspits has confirmed direct consumption like in a 14th century York cesspit containing seeds from blackberries, raspberries, and elderberries. Though rarely consumed today, acorns were eaten in medieval times, especially in oak-rich regions. These tannin-rich nuts required leaching, but provided necessary calories during hard times. Written sources often link acorn use to famines, but archaeological evidence suggests they may have been more commonly used, particularly as flower extenders during winter. Berries brought essential vitamins and seasonal variety, typically eaten fresh during their short season. Berries were occasionally preserved by drying or fermenting. Evidence includes drying racks and ceramic containers with residues consistent with preserved berry products. A 14th century manual, La Ménagère de Paris, extremely tart when raw, were usually steeped in alcohol to produce slow wine-up beverage with both caloric and medicinal value. Household waste and fermentation vessels provide evidence of this practice. Describes preserving berries in honey or wine practices likely adapted by peasants using smaller quantities. Crab apples and wild pears were smaller and more tart than modern fruits, but their nutritional value made them important. Sloes. Elderberries were valued for both culinary and medicinal uses. Archaeological and documentary records confirm their broad use. Rose hips, the fruit of wild roses, appear in archaeological remains at many sites. Some peasant households cultivated basic orchards or maintained fruit trees near their homes. However, access to wild fruits and nuts was not unrestricted. The seasonal availability of fruits and nuts shaped gathering and preservation routines. Even in small amounts, wild fruits and nuts contributed significantly to the diet. Consumption patterns varied by region due to different ecosystems and land management practices. Ultimately, foraging was not just supplemental, it was foundational to food security. Mushrooms and fungi. Mushrooms were another significant yet hard-to-trace food source in the medieval diet. Most evidence for mushroom consumption is indirect tools, residues, and written sources. Residue analysis from cooking pots sometimes detects chemical traces from mushrooms. Species varied regionally. In Central and Eastern Europe, porcini and species of Lactaries and Russula were common. Evidence includes preserved specimens from wet environments and residue traces in cookware. Their spring emergence provided vital nutrients during the Hunger Gap, the period after winter stores ran out, but before new crops matured. Some medieval sites revealed drying structures supported by ethnographic parallels, suggesting mushroom preservation. Traditional calendars and folk knowledge track these cycles, reflecting detailed ecological awareness that likely dated back centuries. Archaeologists have uncovered dried mushroom fragments in sealed storage areas across Eastern Europe, where fungi played a more significant role in the diet. Ethnographic sources also hint at more complex preservation methods, such as fermentation and pickling, though direct medieval evidence for these practices remains scarce. Still, mushrooms contributed meaningfully to the peasant diet, even in small portions. In Slavic and Baltic cultures, mushroom foraging was deeply embedded in local traditions, supported by well-developed knowledge systems. Others viewed their spontaneous growth as divine, representing God's creative power. These contrasting attitudes shaped regional consumption habits and determined how mushroom knowledge was preserved. Sites in these regions often yield specialized tools and processing areas, unlike many parts of Western Europe. Archaeological finds from 15th century monasteries reveal early mushroom growing setups, logs inoculated with spores and stored in dark, damp places. Though mainly in elite or religious settings, this shift indicates the acknowledged value of fungi and the effort invested in their cultivation. This integration made gathering fungi a practical, efficient supplement to daily life rather than a standalone pursuit. Their rich nutritional profile and unique flavors brought variety to an otherwise grain-heavy menu. And the knowledge to harvest them safely reflected one of the most advanced forms of ecological literacy passed down through generations. They were daily staples that offered hydration and nutrition when clean water was unreliable. Fermented grain-based beverages were essential for peasants, providing both calories and safety from waterborne illness. This importance is clearly shown through archaeological finds, historical documents, and artistic depictions. Evidence from settlements near forests often shows tools and facilities used for multiple woodland resources, highlighting this overlap. In contrast, Anglo-Norman and some Germanic societies were more cautious, treating mushrooms as a marginal food. In Western Europe, agaricus species were more typical, growing in pastures rather than forests. Strings of dried mushrooms or drying racks often feature in both archaeological remains and traditional practices, indicating the importance of fungi in maintaining food stability year-round. Morels were widely prized across Europe due to their distinctive appearance, which made them easier to identify. Mushroom foraging followed seasonal rhythms, with autumn being peak time for many species and spring for morels. Drying was the most common preservation method, extending mushroom availability beyond their short growing season. Mushrooms in the medieval diet. In medieval Europe, mushrooms were often dried by threading and hanging them near hearths or inside dedicated drying spaces. Modern nutritional studies reveal that many wild mushroom species are high in protein, some containing up to 35% protein by dry weight along with B vitamins, selenium, potassium, and other vital micronutrients. Certain varieties exposed to sunlight during growth also supply vitamin D, a rare nutrient in plant foods but essential for calcium absorption in diets largely made up of grains and vegetables. These nutritional benefits made mushrooms especially valuable. Identifying edible mushrooms required exceptional ecological knowledge. Discerning them from poisonous lookalikes took careful observation and expertise, often passed down through generations. This wasn't just helpful knowledge. It could mean the difference between life and death. Archaeological and historical evidence occasionally documents such tragedies. In some medieval burials, researchers have found toxins linked to deadly mushroom poisonings, while chronicles speak of deaths attributed to evil fungi. Cultural perceptions of mushrooms varied widely across Europe, leading to differing usage patterns. Religious beliefs added another layer. Some Christian traditions saw mushrooms growing from decaying wood and appearing suddenly after rain as symbols of death or impurity. Mushroom foraging usually occurred alongside other woodland tasks like collecting firewood, hunting, or herding animals. During times of famine or crop failure, mushrooms became even more crucial. By the late Middle Ages, some mushrooms began transitioning from wild to cultivated. Despite limited archaeological traces, mushrooms were a notable part of the medieval peasant diet, especially in woodland regions. Fermented beverages, hydration, and nutrition. In medieval northern and central Europe, ale and beer were far more than just leisure drinks. Understanding the difference between ale and beer during this time is key. Before hops became common in the 14th and 15th centuries, most fermented grain drinks were flavored with herb mixtures called gruit. At Wareham Percy in Yorkshire, for instance, archaeologists found germinated grain remains and these distinctive floors inside peasant homes. Items like ceramic or wooden mash tuns, strainers, and fermentation containers appear frequently. At West Cotton in Northamptonshire, a full brewing setup, including a large ceramic mash tun with brewing residues, was uncovered in a modest peasant dwelling. Written records back this up. Inventories and wills from the 13th century often list brewing gear among even the poorest households. Records from 14th century England suggest an adult might drink a gallon of weak ale daily. Hops first appear in German and Low Country brewing sites in the 12th-13th centuries. Reaching England in the 14th-15th, hops changed everything. Their preservative quality extended beer's shelf life, allowing for larger batches and broader distribution. Archaeological signs of this shift include bigger brewing facilities and hop drying kilns. While this may seem excessive now, it met the energy demands of heavy manual labor. Hop beer kept longer and traveled farther, but the more complex brewing process led to commercial production, reducing home brewing and women's participation. In fruit-growing areas, cider and perry were common. Evidence includes fruit presses and containers with cider residues, especially in France, England, and northern Spain. These drinks were vital when grain was scarce. It may also have raised costs for consumers. Liquid nourishment like beer was often permitted, acknowledging its importance in daily sustenance. Surplus ale could be sold or traded for other essentials, creating opportunities in an otherwise subsistence-based economy. Archaeological findings, such as standardized measuring jugs and purpose-built structures for serving outsiders, support this commercial aspect. Still, archaeological finds suggest that diluted meads or honey-flavored ales were made for special occasions, even in modest homes. Residues from special drinking vessels in feast settings show signs of honey fermentation, suggesting celebratory drinks tied to life events. By the late Middle Ages, increased trade and tighter controls began reshaping how fermented drinks were made and consumed. Archaeological shifts show fewer households brewing, replaced by larger, more specialized facilities. This made it more economical in areas where grain supplies were limited. Legal records also show disputes over brewing rights and complaints about ale quality, underlining how widespread the practice was. Simple wine-related tools sometimes show up in peasant homes, though typically less refined than elite versions. Similar finds across Northern Europe suggest brewing was a typical household task, not limited to specialists. Only later did beer specifically refer to hop versions, which gradually replaced traditional ales. Communal brewing practices, like help ales, involve neighbors working and drinking together. Archaeology occasionally finds oversized brewing tools in small homes, evidence of group production. Court records sometimes express concern over these gatherings, hinting at their unsupervised nature. Archaeological evidence of both types includes brewing equipment, grain processing tools, and residue found in drinking vessels. The term brewster or alewife appears in many medieval texts, referring to women who brewed regularly, often selling extra ale locally. This gave them rare chances to earn income within a male-dominated society. Archaeological finds and documents frequently link brewing with female spaces and roles. Excavations at medieval villages frequently uncover malting floors specialized, areas where grain sprouted in preparation for brewing. It had lower alcohol content, around 2 to 3%, ABV was cloudy, less fizzy, and lacked hops, which meant it spoiled within a week. This led to frequent small batch brewing. Analyzers of vessel residues confirm these traits, revealing grain fermentation byproducts and flavoring herbs. Nutritionally, ale was vital. Reconstructed recipes suggest a quart provided 400 to 500 calories and essential B vitamins. Fermentation also made nutrients more digestible and added modest alcohol for microbial safety. For laborers, this calorie boost wasn't indulgent, it was essential. The brewing process needed specific tools, which are regularly found at rural sites. Brewing was largely women's work for much of the Middle Ages. Peasant ale was very different from today's beer. Ale was consumed throughout the day, not just recreationally. The shift from ale to hop beer unfolded slowly, moving from east to west. For peasants, this had mixed effects. Aside from ale and beer, peasants also drank other fermented beverages based on local resources. Mead, made from honey and water, was less common due to honey's cost. In wine-producing regions, peasants sometimes drank watered-down wine or pet-fermented grape pumice with added water. In Eastern Europe, kava, a fermented rye bread drink, offered similar nutrition to ale while using less grain. Beyond nutrition, fermented drinks had social and cultural value. The church generally viewed fermented drinks favorably. Monasteries brewed extensively, and parish records mention church ales events combining brewing and fundraising. Excavations at religious sites consistently reveal substantial brewing infrastructure. Institutional acceptance of moderate alcohol intake. even during Lent and fast days, reflected the vital nutritional role of ale. For peasants, brewing offered rare economic flexibility within feudal constraints. Records from manorial courts regularly address rules on ale pricing and quality, highlighting its economic role. Written sources from the period also describe the rise of brewing guilds, licensing systems, and quality standards. What was once a domestic task evolved into a regulated profession. For many peasants, this meant buying ale rather than brewing it, altering economic behavior and possibly dietary access. Fermented drinks were not luxury items, but daily essentials, providing energy, nutrients, and safe hydration. The idea that medieval people avoided water entirely due to contamination risks is an oversimplification. In fact, archaeological and historical records show water use varied by region, season, and source quality. Evidence consistently shows even the poorest families used valuable grain to brew, highlighting its central role in survival. The 12th century regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum advised, drink freely from a clear spring without fear. Household and monastery records also show investments in clean water access. Water, herbal teas, and fruit-based drinks. In areas with poor water sources, evidence of brewing increases, pointing to adaptive choices based on local environments rather than simple preferences. Specialized vessels with herbal residues, along with the herbs themselves, have been found in homes. Herb selection varied regionally, but mint appears commonly across Europe. These often included mint, chamomile, linden, and sage, used for both flavor and medicinal value. Although alcoholic beverages were crucial for hydration, people also drank water and other non-alcoholic fluids. At Warham Percy in Yorkshire, for example, archaeologists found several well-lined structures linked to peasant homes. Similar features appear across Europe. Excavations reveal infrastructure like wells and springs across village sites, showing significant effort to secure clean water. Stable isotope analysis of human teeth also indicates different consumption habits. Some individuals consume more water, while others relied more on fermented drinks. Archaeological evidence includes pressing tools and vessels with residues from apples, pears, and berries. Evidence for these includes residues indicating partial fermentation. Some drinks were made by soaking fruit in water, similar to today's infused waters, providing flavor and nutrition. The simplest juices were fresh and unfermented, sometimes noted in texts describing harvest time refreshment. Texts from the time often warned against stagnant or visibly dirty water, but also praised spring or well water. Where clean water was plentiful, it played a bigger role in daily hydration. In Eastern Europe, spring-harvested birch sap provided a mineral-rich drink, documented in historical texts and special collecting tools. Finds of protein-rich residues in vessels show its use in peasant diets. High in protein, B vitamins, and minerals, whey was especially popular during harvest when both hydration and nutrition were critical. Summer brought fruit juices and herbal teas. Fall featured semi-fermented fruit drinks, while winter relied more on stored brews. Residue patterns across archaeological contexts reflect these seasonal shifts. Archaeological discoveries include charcoal filtration layers in wells and water jars, an effective method to reduce contaminants. Boiling water or mixing it with wine or vinegar were also practiced and recorded, offering limited protection against illness even before germ theory. Water purification and herbal infusions. Isotope studies sometimes reveal differences in hydration between children and adults from the same community. Though basic by modern standards, medieval water treatment showed a good grasp of sanitation. Herbal infusions, early forms of tea, were another common hydration method. The 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen documented various herbal remedies, suggesting widespread use. Some residues even match specific remedies described in medieval medical texts. At Rattray in Scotland, archaeologists discovered preserved dried herbs, confirming their storage and use. Fruit-based and dairy drinks. Fruit drinks, particularly during summer and fall, offered another hydration source. More often, fruit drinks were lightly fermented, preserving them better than fresh juice while remaining low in alcohol. Whey, a cheese-making byproduct, also served as a drink. Seasonality and children's hydration seasonal availability shaped beverage choices. Spring water was freshest after winter rains. Children's drinking habits offer a unique insight. While beer was consumed by all ages, archaeological and documentary evidence suggests children were given weaker versions or more non-alcoholic options. Records occasionally mention suitable drinks for children, diluted whey, fruit infusions, and very weak ale. Regional differences and religious influence. Non-alcoholic beverages vary by region. In Mediterranean areas, diluted vinegar drinks similar to modern shrubs appear in archaeological samples and written sources. Religious practices also shaped beverage use. During Lent and fast, devout individuals often abstained from ale, choosing water or herbal teas instead. Evidence from pious communities shows different beverage patterns linked to fasting. Some herbs used in infusions, such as hyssop, held religious significance and appear more often in religious contexts. Social and gender patterns. Social roles influence what people drank. Women and children more often consumed herbal teas and fruit-based drinks, while laboring men favored ale for its calories. This appears in residue analysis of vessels used by different household members and in stable isotope data from human remains. Later medieval trends. Specialized vessels for different drinks became common. Written records from the 14th and 15th centuries show a growing variety of such beverages, reflecting broader cultural changes in food and drink. Far from the bleak image often portrayed, it reveals ingenuity, nutritional insight, and ecological balance qualities still relevant today. Toward the late Middle Ages, non-alcoholic drink use became more complex. Evidence shows peasants had detailed knowledge of water sources, herb properties, and preservation techniques, forming a hydration strategy based on local conditions and seasonal availability. Archaeological remains of these technologies appear consistently across medieval Europe. Occasional meat or dairy completed the nutritional picture. Seasonal cycles of fasting and feasting, tied to agricultural rhythms and religious calendars, helped communities manage scarcity and celebrate abundance. Throughout the medieval era, water and non-alcoholic beverages were vital, not just alternatives to ale, but valuable drinks in their own right. Processes like fermentation, for instance, enhanced nutrient absorption and produced beneficial compounds that weren't present in the raw ingredients. This practical knowledge formed a sophisticated kind of science based on careful observation and repeated trial and error over generations, even if it was not acknowledged by the literate elites who authored most surviving texts. Historical records describe how communities responded to failed harvests, livestock disease, or economic instability by foraging more wild foods, substituting ingredients, or innovating new methods of food preservation. Famines brought real suffering, and even under normal conditions, the diet lacked the variety and consistent supply we expect today. Archaeological evidence from famine periods shows clear signs of desperation bread made with tree bark, unusual wild plants in cooking vessels, and skeletal signs of malnutrition. Compared to today, the environmental impact of the medieval peasant diet was surprisingly small. While there's no need to return to medieval lifestyles, we may benefit from reclaiming some of the ecological wisdom these historical practices offer. Yet despite these hardships, medieval peasants created a food system that supported most of Europe's population for generations. They achieved this with limited tools, restricted access to land and resources, and the burden of supporting landowners through taxes and rents. Most food was grown and eaten locally, with little to no packaging or processing involved, but as the outcome of centuries of accumulated knowledge and innovation. In these modest but nourishing meals, we can see the creativity and resilience of ordinary people who, despite enormous constraints, built a food system that endured for centuries. As we grapple with modern issues like climate change, food insecurity, and sustainable agriculture, there's much we can learn from how medieval communities fed themselves. Animal products were used in full, with almost nothing going to waste. Livestock were part of the farming cycle, eating crop leftovers and providing manure, thus supporting sustainable soil fertility. Even wild resources were usually harvested in a way that let plants regenerate naturally. Archaeological findings from known periods of hardship reflect this, revealing uncommon food remains in layers associated with times of famine. The knowledge needed to sustain this food system was passed down mostly through hands-on experience and oral tradition, rather than written documents. Conclusion: a resilient diet skeletal evidence from peasant graves often shows adults in reasonable health, even with harsh living conditions. The medieval peasant diet, as revealed by archaeology, historical sources, and scientific studies, stands as a remarkable human adaptation to difficult environments and social inequality. The diet's foundation, whole grains, pottage, vegetables, and limited meat offered balanced nutrition. Though simple by modern standards, it supported physical labor and resilience. Grains and legumes provided complementary proteins. Wild and garden plants added vitamins and minerals. Preservation methods without refrigeration, such as drying, fermenting, and storing in pits or smokehouses further illustrate their sophisticated food strategies. Together, this evidence paints a picture of a deeply resourceful and nutritionally sound food culture that deserves more recognition for its resilience and innovation. Preservation methods in the medieval period not only prolonged the shelf life of food, but often improved its nutritional value. Women, who were primarily responsible for food preparation, preserved essential knowledge about identifying edible wild plants, processing ingredients that could be toxic, managing fermentation, and many other skills critical to survival. The medieval peasant diet also showed great adaptability during times of crisis. This ability to shift strategies and avoid total reliance on any single food source gave medieval communities a resilience that allowed them to survive challenges that could have been devastating. That said, this isn't to idealize what was undoubtedly a difficult life. The physical effort required by medieval farming life demanded a high-calorie intake, which wasn't always available, especially during the Hunger Gap, when winter stores had run out and new crops were still growing. The knowledge embedded in their practices, from crop rotation to fermentation, from identifying edible wild plants to preserving seasonal harvests, forms a valuable and complex body of practical science. Their emphasis on whole grains and legumes, low levels of waste, seasonal eating, use of both wild and farm foods, and advanced preservation methods hold lessons that remain relevant today. The simple meals that sustained medieval peasants' loaves of coarse bread, hearty pottage, preserved vegetables, and the occasional egg or piece of cheese should be seen not as just survival food. So the next time you eat a slice of whole grain bread, consider the legacy behind it.